prize of the evening is Les is going to tell us about a big project that he's got.
Do you have a microphone? Nobody can hear you without a microphone. The Historical Society has recently acquired a couple of hundred chairs. We're trying to put furniture in the building over there. So we acquired a couple of hundred chairs, which we are in the process of refinishing. And they are fine old wooden chairs, and we're putting varnish on them, and they look great after we put the varnish on them, considering the fact that before we put the varnish on them, they look like this.
Oh my God.
So Timer and I have done 30 or 40 of them, but then we decided that perhaps we were depriving everyone of the pleasure of doing all this wonderful work. So, tomorrow morning, between 9 and 12, we are going to have a varnishing party over at the Historical Society. Bring your brush. We will supply the chairs and the varnish. So if anybody is interested in doing that, please show up. We'll be very happy to have you. Also, some of these chairs are going to be refinished and sold in a craft motif. So if that is your forte, then you're also welcome to come over and be creative with that. We are also looking for some tables. We'd like to get some tables here at the town hall. If anyone has an inn, you can get us a discount. Somebody knows someone who has some tables that we can get. All suggestions are welcome. We have several projects coming up which will require money, and so we want to start running some fundraisers over at the Historical Society, perhaps craft shows, bingo, something like that. If you want to contribute to that or suggest something for that, you're more than welcome. My phone number is 1964. Call me at any reasonable hour and tell me what you want to do. I am going to send a clipboard around, and please, if you don't want to do the chairs tomorrow and you want to do them some other time, give me a call. I'll be happy to open up the building for you. Okay? Any questions about any of that? Start this going around. You have any other suggestions, things you want to sign up for, things you want to do, things you'd like to see the Historical Society do? Don't be bashful. Okay?
That's not the only clipboard we have, by the way. We have several out here. Different committees, different things that you might want to get involved with. And speaking of getting involved, the Historical Society is now involved in the collection of the bottles and cans, the deposit cans up at the recycling center. And along that line, we need about 10 people to operate it. What I'd like to do is find about 10 people, so that people are working 4 hours a month, one time during the week. And I'll have this clipboard sitting out there too. Name, telephone number, and we'll schedule you in when you're available. Okay, tonight, if you weren't confused with the flyer we sent out, mentioned something about lies about Brinton. But this should be a fun evening. We're looking forward to it. Bob's done 29 of these things, I think. This is the first time I have seen him this excited about a subject. So I think we're in store for a pretty good evening. Bob?
No, I'm not going home. Looking out here at over 150 people, 160 or whatever you are, all I can say is, this better be good. By way of introduction, we've done, this is our 29th historical talk, and I didn't do all of them, and that's why you're here, I guess. But we've really, I think, done a pretty good job. Tonight's going to be a little different. It's going to be, it's not going to be scholarly. Many of the stories you're going to hear were passed down in the oral tradition as kind of, you always hear urban legends. Well, we have rural legends too. And whenever you have an oral tradition, the stories tend to migrate and change. So some of these I've heard several different versions of, and I'll give you the one that I like best. I want to kind of dedicate tonight's talk to two people. Edie Carrington, who's sitting in the back, and who has given me a lot of encouragement ever since I first mentioned about a year ago that I wanted to do something on the dark side of Bethany history. It took me a while to come up with a title. First of all, it was going to be Scandals and Scoundrels. That was pretty well received. But anyway, Edie has kind of given me those three little words, go for it. And to my wife who's sitting here, who has uttered, as usual, before I start every talk, those words that I love to hear, keep it brief. I guess if we have the lights, we can start. So far, this mic is behaving itself. Can you hear me in the back pretty well?
No.
Too bad. And the
It's on.
projector.
It's on.
Oh, it is. Okay. All you need is me.
Yeah.
Heckler.
You're a little late, but that's okay. With this particular time of year, it seemed appropriate to look at the dark side of history. And this is as good a way to start as any. This photograph my son Will took. Actually, Will took virtually all the photographs that you're going to see tonight. At the Woodward Farm a couple of years ago, a really nice kind of a spooky display to get us in the mood. And as you know from the flyer that came out, you have to ignore that. I don't know how to stop it. There are 10 tales, and these are the 10 that, come on in, George. Just a little bit late, but that's all right. That's okay, no excuses, please. The only thing I'll tell you at this point about these 10 tales is that they're in chronological order. And we'll start off with the first. We're going to be spanning 4 centuries of Bethany history. So we'll start off with a tale that takes place in the 17th century. Boundary by combat. This particular tale has been recorded long after it took place, of course, and it involves an area in the northern part of the town where the present-day towns of Prospect, Naugatuck, and Bethany meet. Pretty much what we're looking at here is north on Amity Road, looking toward, well, that's Route 42 now. I'm going to go a little further along. That's Edwards Road on the right. The mountain directly in front of you is where this particular event took place. This is a picture from a photograph from the 1950s. It's a little easier to take photographs of landforms in those days because there were not as many trees. And it has to do with a line. Well, not that kind of a line, of course. There was a boundary line, and it was the boundary line between the Milford colony and the New Haven colony. And the legend goes that the two towns were unable to reach a decision or reach an agreement as to the boundary line. And they decided to to settle their differences by combat. And each town had champions who had proven that they were the best fighters in their town. And these champions met at the summit of the area where 3 trees were located. And if you look at this 18th century map, Western Rock, that's our West Rock, you're looking back a long time in this map. There's a copy of the map that's in the Yale archives. And you see those 3 trees? These are called the 3 brothers. And the question was, the boundary line between the 2 colonies, which colony owned that area? The story goes that the champions from the 2 towns fought from sunrise to sunset, were unable at the end of the day to declare who was the winner. And the decision was that would mean that the 3 brothers would be a boundary between those 2 colonies. In the 19th century, the 3 brothers looked something like this. They were chestnut trees. Chestnut trees have a long life. And these chestnut trees were mentioned in early boundary descriptions going back to the 17th and 18th centuries. And they were 3 trees growing from one root. So actually the map was a little bit inaccurate. Because the chestnut blight killed off the chestnut trees in this area, the trees died, and interestingly enough, they fell into 3 different towns. This is what the trees looked like in the mid-20th century. One of the parts of the tree fell into each town. I believe this is the Bethany part. The pile of stones in the center marks the boundary of the 3 towns. And I don't have any close-up shots, but if you look carefully, you would find that these stones were inscribed with the initials of the towns and the dates that the selectmen perambulated the bounds in order to determine the exact boundaries on a periodic basis. Selectmen don't do that anymore. I don't know. Maybe we should make them do that. Earn that money, you know? I have something I wanted to read you, but I see I don't have much light. I'm going to get up here and see if I can get it on. We're going to talk about the bare facts, 1766. I want to read you a little something. I've never read to the Historical Society. I once read to a group at the Amity Adult Education. This is an excerpt from a letter dated 1873 in which a gentleman is recalling his grandfather and grandmother moving to Bethany, and if I can read it, I will now try to comply with your request as far as I can remember and have knowledge of our family. I remember hearing about my father and mother tell of his father, Ebenezer Hitchcock, moving in 1747 from New Haven into Bethany. The first half of the 18th century is when permanent settlers moved out here to Bethany, by the way. They located about 3/4 of a mile. I don't know if that gives me any more light or not. You get that one. 3/4 of a mile southwest of the center. I've heard my father and grandmother recall that when they moved from New Haven to Bethany, the neighbors came and with sorrowful faces and cried and shook hands and said goodbye as though they were never to see them again. That's what Bethany was like in the first half of the 18th century. And I simply show the junior high school because that's about 3/4 of a mile southwest of the center. But that's not the story for tonight. I just wanted to get you in the mood for the 18th century. Tonight's story is about a bear, and I've heard different dates for this. One of them that you hear, that I've seen in print, is 1776, which can't be correct since it appeared in the Connecticut Journal in 1766. And this is about a bear, the last bear to appear in Bethany. Kind of what Bethany looked like in the mid-18th century. This map happens to be dated 1766. If you've been in the children's room of the library, Bethany Library, you may have seen the mural that was done by Lois North in 1934, as a WPA project. It's a reduced copy of the original, which the Historical Society has in its collection in extremely poor condition. But it features the Bethany bear. This was written up also by John Warner Barber in 1836 because the bear was fairly remarkable. The event takes place on Beacon Road and in a house that stood exactly where the present Weber residence is located on the northern side of Beacon Road. And this Bruin was audacious enough to help himself to some of the family's livestock. Over a 2-week period, it killed a lamb, it killed sheep, and it did a lot of damage to some beehives that the family had. But the ultimate insult was when it broke into the milk room, drank milk from several milk pans, and carried a large basin of cream containing 3 quarts out of a window and licked it clean, turned it upside down without breaking it, and left it in the rear dooryard. This is the early photo of that area with the present Weber house as it looked about somewhere in the teens. The bear was pursued by some of the neighbors with their hunting dogs, was treed, was shot and killed. It weighed in at 162 pounds, good-sized bear, and it was consumed by the residents. Very thrifty. The last bear seen in Bethany. Goodbye. A pirate's lair. I had a lot of fun with this talk because everybody came up to me and said, well, I know this one isn't true. I know that one isn't true. Most people were wrong. And I invariably did not let on. Pirate's lair. Well, we don't think about pirates in Bethany or treasure in Bethany. But indeed, that's the case. Or at least partially the case. In this house, which was probably built around 1730 on Amity Road, just get my trusty pointer out here, if I can find where I am. This is Valley Road, this is Amity Road. You are here. The Dayton House, the Captain Dayton House, still stands on Amity Road. We're going to see a little bit later that it's been moved when the road was widened in 1933. There was a novel, typical 19th century novel, kind of thrilling and romantic, that was written in 1874 by Israel Warren. It was one of those as told to stories. So it's a great story. You could do a whole talk on just this. I'm going to just do it quickly in deference to my wife's admonition. However, it's useful to know that the story was told by Captain Dayton's son, so it kind of skewed it toward making Captain Dayton look like a good guy. Chauncey Judd is kind of a hero of the story. Very briefly, it goes like this. Ebenezer Dayton was a peddler. Along comes the revolution in Long Island. Along comes the Revolutionary War. Long Island's taken over by the Tories, and Ebenezer Dayton sees an opportunity to improve his station in life. So he gets he is given the right to be a privateer. That's kind of like a license to steal. You know, you can go and you can rob English ships and you can keep the booty, which he did. He captured a number of ships, 3 or 4 ships, and kept all of the goods from it, and he was allowed to keep it. That was his reward for attacking British shipping during the Revolutionary War. And he brought some of it to Bethany, to Amity Road. The plot was hatched in this tavern in Seymour. Building still stands. Up until maybe 10 years ago, it was still a tavern. I can remember as a historical investigation, of course, actually patronizing this establishment. In the name of historical investigation, of course. The conspirators broke into the Dayton house, tied up Mrs. Dayton, took everything of value, because Captain Dayton was a privateer. There probably was the richest house in town. I mean, he had gold and silver and plate and all kinds of good stuff that he had stolen. And that's why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Anyway, when they made their escape from the Dayton house, they went north. It happened that they met Chauncey Judd, 16-year-old boy who had escorted his girlfriend and was returning home at 2 or 3 in the morning. Sounds a little scandalous to me, but this kind of interesting. This is Chauncey and his girlfriend Ditha, as portrayed by community school students in a play called Chauncey Judd that was performed in 1982 as part of the sesquicentennial celebration. I just like that. We got a bunch of those. They threatened Chauncey's life. Great story. They started at the Dayton house, which is A, I guess, and then there's a whole bunch of letters we won't go to. Obviously, they went to Long Island where they were captured. Very briefly, some of them were put in jail in Newgate Prison, very unpleasant place where they kept the prisoners underground in a mine. That's before modern technology. The local farmers rowed a whaleboat across the Sound and captured these people, brought them back. The reason that I call this a pirate's lair is because at the time that these events took place, and even recently, in Long Island, they consider Ebenezer Dayton to be a pirate because evidently he found that being a privateer was sort of limited because you could only plunder ships of your enemies. But he evidently went beyond that and was able to plunder other ships, which kind of makes him a pirate, and Bethany Pirate's Lair here on Amity Road. And that's his house as it looks today. Which brings us to cider barrel rules. What on earth is this about? This is a little bit of a stretch because this takes place kind of on the Hamden-Bethany town line, maybe somewhere closer to Hamden, but we won't go into that. And this deals with an extremely strong man. We're going to deal with a couple of Doolittles tonight. And this Doolittle was named Caleb. And he was at least 300 pounds. And he was noted for being a wrestler. Matter of fact, he had a reputation for being a wrestler throughout the area. And if you've ever watched any of the Western movies, you know that if somebody's a good gunfighter, what happens? The young men all want to challenge him to make a name for themselves. And so it was with Caleb. Many people, younger people, were anxious to prove themselves and would challenge him. And on one occasion, a young man from Waterbury came to this area and with the intent of engaging Caleb in a wrestling match. And so a group of people gathered. And Caleb Doolittle was always willing to oblige people who had this kind of a desire. And however, he mentioned that he was a little bit thirsty, and before his proposed match, he would like to quench his thirst. And the beverage was cider. Of course, it comes from apple trees. I just love this photo, so I get to do stuff like that. And whether it was hard cider, I'm not really sure. We'll let you figure that one out. However, the story, and we're going to get to the punchline very fast here, was that he picked up acknowledging that he had a powerful thirst, he picked up the barrel of cider over his head and drank from it the bung. Well, for some reason, his opponent, his possible opponent, was no longer interested in wrestling and decided to leave the scene. Many of these, by the way, you may have heard this part of the story. I'm going to be giving you the rest of the story. The rest of the story with this is that Caleb Doolittle is buried in the Mount Carmel burial ground, which is very near the intersection of Downs Road and Hamden. That's the part of Downs Road that they don't know how to spell. And Gaylord Mountain Road. And this is the little cemetery. Unfortunately, his stone isn't there anymore. The cemetery was vandalized about 20 or 25 years ago. Vandals went in and pushed all the stones over. There were no houses in it. I don't know why people do stuff like that. This was what the stone looked like. I'm sorry it's not a better one. Interesting thing was, it reads, if you can't read it from the back, in memory of Caleb Doolittle, who died April 31st, 1838, age 65. Of course, there isn't any April 31st. Because of this, Caleb Doolittle's stone made its way into the Believe It or Not column in the papers about 30 years ago or so. Just a little story about. This is part of a little article about Caleb Doolittle. And I really like apple trees and blossoms. The Trail of Tears. Okay, here's another one. I think I've stumped everybody on this one. This takes place in 1833, and it's neatly bracketed in time by the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which had nothing directly to do with this, and the removal of 14,000 Cherokee Indians who were driven west in the winter time. And this end of the trail sculpture kind of gives you the idea, although I think many of the Cherokees were on foot. 25% of them died. 4,000 of them died on the trail. They were driven to Oklahoma by the United States Army. And the woodland Indians are the people that lived here, the Poggusets, and there were Poggusets living in Bethany when Bethany was incorporated in 1832. There weren't many of them. Most of them had already died from disease. They just didn't have any immunities to the European diseases. And that's our Trail of Tears. And it's important to note that Bethany was in step with the rest of the country in terms of its treatment of the Indians. In 1832, one of the first things that the Board of Selectmen did was to try and solve the Bethany's Indian problem. And the problem was there were some very poor Indians living here, and somebody had to feed them, and the Board of Selectmen was anxious that it not be Bethany taxpayers. To that end, the story written by Samuel Orcutt in his Indian history, I'll leave up there just for a minute, tells of the Mack family in Bethany, who were paupers. I mean, they were very poor. They made baskets, but they just couldn't make it. I mean, their way of life is destroyed. So the only thing you can do in that case is move them on. And that's what the Board of Selectmen did. They purchased a piece of land in Derby and moved the Indians out of town. In the South in the 50s, when counties had people who were mentally ill and would need costly services, what happened was the county would buy a bus ticket and just send them to the next county. That was called Greyhound therapy. And something like this, I guess, happened with the unfortunate Mack family. I had to throw this in. Will found this one. You remember 20 years ago, the public service announcements on TV about not littering and the sad Indian Trail of Tears. I had to do it. Come on. And the sad part of this is that not long after they were there, they caught smallpox and all of the adults died. Few of the children were inoculated and were saved. The Indians were buried right there because they had smallpox, and there is I've never been there, but there is a small cemetery. I think there were two different settlements of the Mack family. I wish I had a better photograph for you, but that's the story of our Bethany Trail of Tears. The only thing I'd add to it is there also is a tradition that because in those days medical students were very desirous of obtaining cadavers for science, for research, that the Indian graves were plundered. I don't know whether that's true or not. I don't know. Why would you pick somebody that died of smallpox? But that's the legend, and it certainly speaks to the lack of rest for the red man's ashes. Oh, correction, this should be 1851. There isn't any quiz at the end, but I just like to be historically correct. This is a typo. A cut above the rest. Okay, many of you may have heard of this, and we're going to go very quickly through the part that you've heard, and then we're going to give you the rest of the story. And this involves an unfortunate gentleman in town that lived on Sanford Road, which is a road that no longer is a public road connecting Brooks Road with West Shepherd Avenue. And there were a couple of Sanford families there. Charlie Sanford was kind of involved in a spiritual movement that involved a number of people in Camden. And they were followers of the Wakemanites. And in the middle of the 19th century, there were many groups that thought the world was coming to an end, and they could look at the Bible and they knew it was going to happen at 2:30 p.m. on such and such a date, and then they were wrong, and then they'd have to recalculate. He got kind of mixed up in that. This group of people in Hamden that he kind of fell under their sway were known as the Swamp Angels. Kind of a derisive term. Believe me, they didn't call themselves that. And cut above the rest is dealing with basically an axe murder. I mean, we didn't have Lizzie Borden, but we did have Charlie Sanford, and he certainly did as well as she did. And he may well have outdone her. This happens to be an old photograph of the causeway on Downs Road. Intersection of Downs Road and Brooks Road. The location of the murders actually was in Bethany and in Woodbridge, and the two people were killed. One was Enoch Sperry, who lived at Sperry Falls. Then if you've been to that nice park in Woodbridge, there's a cellar hole there, and that's where Enoch Sperry lived. And the other person that was killed was Ichabod Umberfield, who lived near here. And Ichabod, it's not a great name for someone, Ichabod Umberfield. I mean, it's spooky right there. I told you it was going to be the dark side of Bethany history. Ichabod Umberfield and Enoch Sperry were both murdered by Charlie Sanford with an axe, very brutally murdered. I will not go into any details for the benefit of those who are squeamish, unless you encourage me to. But needless to say, after he was apprehended at Pitchfork Point by the neighbors, he was brought to trial and convicted of the brutal murders. There are some interesting newspaper articles as well as trial transcripts that give you probably more detail than you'd like. And this is the Sperry Cemetery as it looked in the 1950s before the Board of Selectmen had cemeteries mowed regularly. And this is where Ichabod Umberfield is buried. Mr. Sperry is buried in Westfield, and I don't have a photograph of his tombstone, but this was taken some years ago. And a close-up of the tombstone says, you probably can't read it, but I'll read it to you. In memory of Ichabod Umberfield, who was murdered by a maniac. January 3rd, 1856, age 71. And underneath it says, a mournful New Year's Day to my surviving friends. How soon I'm called away, soon as the year begins. And you notice it's January 1st. Happy New Year. And now we have to follow the career of Charlie Sanford, because Ichabod Umberfield's career is cut short, as it were. And he was incarcerated in the county jail on the Green, on Church Street. This is before surely actually before the jail was built on Wheelie Avenue. But he didn't survive very long. The legend is that he was given the black bottle, meaning that he was given some poison, which was a thrifty way to make a life sentence extremely short. And the rest of the story is, there is a legend at East Bethany that Elbert Downs, that would be Study's grandfather, as a young man, went with some of the Doolittles who would have remembered Charlie Sanford to Peabody Museum. And Charlie Sanford not only killed by the axe, he also lived by the axe. In other words, he was a wood chopper, he was a woodcutter. And because of this, he had experienced a very severe injury to his leg as a result of an accident in his youth. And when this group of Bethany people went through Peabody Museum, they viewed an exhibit showing the advancement of man through various stages. And they became convinced, along with some other Bethany people, that one of the skeletons on exhibit showing the evolution of man was Charlie Sanford, because of the architecture of his jaw, because of his leg injury and stature, and evidently some other characteristics that I'm not aware of. My recollection is he was not at the end of the line of evolution. So maybe Charlie Sanford, our famous axe murderer, achieved some permanent fame in Peabody Museum. Or perhaps not. Death of a hired man. Boy, did I get people guessing on this one. But this is a good one, and this is going to have a rest of the story too. This takes place in 1886. On this small road. Now, I know George Benedetti started to squirm in his seat here. Don't worry, George.
All right.
This is what Wooding Hill Road looked like about 1900. This house, as it appears today, this small house, was inhabited by a very small farmer, not a big farmer, Wales Doolittle. And he had a hired man by the name of William Ford. I show you this excerpt from the 1880 grand list of Bethany, just to show you that he had a house and 2 acres, 14 acres of land. He had 16 acres. Not a big farm. He wasn't a wealthy man. He had a cow. He must have had a clock. But he's a post-surgeon. He had a military exemption as a post-surgeon. Must have been in the Civil War. I don't know. Interesting. Because we're going to get to the Civil War again in a moment. I hope. George, take it easy. In this house lived Will Wooding. This is Will Wooding in his younger days. And Will Wooding was, as a young man, happened to stumble upon the atrocity that happened in the house further north on Wooding Hill Road, in Wales Doolittle's house. So Will Wooding is only here as a witness. We don't have a lot of witnesses to these things. But in his old age, in the 50s, he gave testimony to George Vail, some of which he wrote up in an Anthony Starr issue of that period. Make a long story short, and to save you from more gory details, Will Doolittle was apt to drink a little too much sometimes. And he evidently came home and found that William Ford, a man of small stature, middle-aged, had not done some work to his satisfaction. And he started to beat him. And Wheels Doolittle was noted for having a temper. And on this particular occasion, he lost it. And he beat William Ford mercilessly for hours. He punched him, kicked him. When he could no longer stand up, he kicked him in the face and the chest. At one point, he threw him down a full set of stairs, followed him down, and continued to beat him until he was dead. Whoops, go back. William Ford was a very poor man. He was just a farmhand on a very poor farm. He was a pauper. He had nothing. So the Board of Selectmen had to bury him at town expense. And believe me, we spared expense. You'll find in a couple of the cemeteries in town where we buried paupers in the 19th century, and each one of them was given a handsome stone with a number on it. William Ford is 370. That's what he got. Did we have 370 paupers? No. Bethany must have gotten a bunch of used stones, and we just used them. We just used them as they came. Whenever one was on the top of the pile, the next pauper got. Footnote to that is, when the Historical Society took over the old town hall, we still have a dozen of these. So, if anybody is indigent, there's hope. However, starting about 50 years ago, people started to be concerned with the fact that possibly William Ford was a Civil War veteran, and that this was not a very nice way to treat a veteran of the Great War between the states. And promptly, a half a century or so later, the Veterans of Foreign Wars replaced the number with this stone, William Ford. So that brings us right up to date. I think that was 2 years ago that was put up. It was about 50 years after it was first suggested. A horse of a different color. We're getting up, you'll notice, to pretty late in the 19th century. Things are getting more familiar. And this deals with the naming of a particular landform in East Bethany. Wrong color. Right horse. This has to do with a horse that was, I don't know, dogs are vicious. I don't think horses can be vicious. But this horse was unusually difficult. Lots of things have been alluded to over the years in East Bethany that could be termed events that would be on the dark side. I mean, I've heard people talking about a Lake Watrous monster. There's no Lake Watrous monster. If you go by Lake Watrous and you see things like this coming out of the water, it's an aeration system that was installed this year by South Central Regional Water. But I've heard, especially high school students, for some reason, these stories have gotten around that there's something spooky about Downs Road. The other one you hear about is the Downs Road Monster. How many have heard of the Downs Road Monster? Raise your hand. Okay, yeah, a few people, okay. What? I don't know. However, as far back as the 19th century, early 19th century, this is West Rock, this is Madmere Mountain, and it's called the Devil's Backbone. So that it's always been kind of this feeling of the dark side. The horse in question was according to the legend, was a very light-colored horse. Now, whether it was an albino or not, I really can't tell. Everybody said it was a very light horse. I asked Linda Francois what she knew about albino horses, and she said, well, they just existed. She didn't know much about them. So I don't think that would account for a horse's actions. The owner of this horse was Henry Doolittle. Oh, another Doolittle. You got one more to go, by the way, before you get refreshments. One more Doolittle. And Henry Doolittle lived in this kind of spooky-looking house. Henry Doolittle was kind of a character. Old-timers knew him as Woodchuck Doolittle. And he was famous for not changing his clothes. He was known to layer his clothing as the cold weather progressed. Instead of buttons, he sewed the clothing on, so you knew it didn't come off until a change in the season. Anyway, enough about Woodchuck Doolittle. I remember Woodchuck Doolittle. This is his barn. It's in back of the house. House is still there, but it's now a studio. It's not used as a house anymore. This is an old dump rake that is on the property. And his horse was used for this kind of purpose. The next person that comes into this story is Theron Allen. And he lived on the corner of Sperry Road and Hatfield Hill Road. His house still stands. Pretty recent picture. And his wife lived there as an elderly lady. Some people remember her sitting out on the porch in the 20s or 30s, 20s I guess, early 30s. Very elderly lady. And Rosella Allen. It's called a Rosella. If you look this up in Alice Plummer's book, it's a Rosella Allen house. Tyler Davidson writes of Theron Allen in his reminiscences that he was killed by this horse, being kicked. He was kicked by the horse. And the way this happened was the horse was one of these horses, I guess, that doesn't want to stay confined. And in trying to capture the runaway horse that had been missing for over a day, it was found on east of Downs Road near Holy Road in the area that we call Madmere Mountain. Theron Allen, which is how the mountain got its name. Theron Allen was buried along with later on with his wife Rosella in the Sperry Cemetery. Interestingly enough, it's the smallest cemetery in town, and the Allen Stone is the largest monument in town. That's me, that's the monument. Interesting story about the monument. It cost a great deal of money in 1934 when Rosella Allen died. She left in her will that she wanted most of her estate to go into a monument, and there's her estate right there. It was all carved in Barry, Vermont, and shipped down to Bethany, but disappeared. And it was found that that the monument was loaded on a truck in a crate, and it had run off the road into a river, and they were able to salvage it without any damage to the monument. The truck was ruined, but the monument made it to Bethany, was set up, and There it is. A flight of fancy. I fooled everyone on this one. I think. 1900. We're really getting up to date. Those cookies are really getting close. This doesn't have anything to do with a heavier than air craft like this plane. And it happens before 1920, when Tyler Davidson writes of the first aeroplane landing north of Bethany Center, which is where our airport ended up. And it's before the first airport in 1924. And it's before the first Curtiss jetty, such as this, that was used in World War I, flew into town. Before our hangar was built. I love this foggy picture. Again, I just like it, so you're going to have to suffer through it. But, you know, for Bethany's dark side talk, I think this fits in nicely. Couldn't resist it. Very early in the century, a lot of people became interested in aviation, in flying. And one particular person, Julius Doolittle, there we are, the Doolittles again, who lived on Litchfield Turnpike in this house. And Julius was pretty well educated. He was a teacher for a while and a farmer, and fascinated with flight before the Wright brothers. And he experimented with various types of aircraft, not powered aircraft, more like gliders, or probably today we have no photograph of what he built. We have a number of people wrote about what he did. As far as I know, the closest we can come is a hang glider. It probably was something like a modern day hang glider. At any rate, in this field, across from that house, that's the present day location of the house, stood this barn, which has since been moved to the other side of Litchfield Turnpike and made into a house. And unfortunately, one of Flying Machine Doolittle's attempts was witnessed by a number of people when he tried to fly off the roof of this barn. Evidently, he had miscalculated the engineering, and instead of soaring into the wild blue yonder, as he had anticipated, instead, he ended up plummeting into a manure pile. And from that day on, he was called Flying Machine Doolittle. That's a tough one to live down. Okay, we're up to the 20th century. Red light on Litchfield Turnpike, 1936. I picked the year 1936 because we have a newspaper article that documents the events that took place. It's not this red light that's in front of the Historical Society building. Notice the clever tie-in. I hope you're appreciating this. You have much appreciation time left. Most people confuse the business that I'm talking about tonight with the Perkins Tavern. Perkins Tavern was very famous. It was well known. Mrs. Perkins was proficient at baking donuts, which were known for miles around. And it was a reputable establishment, although there is a sign there, the 3 rings for Valentine. That's over 100 years ago. And the gentleman here seems to be partaking of some liquid refreshment. Taverns in those days were very respectable places where a traveler could sleep, where he could eat, where he could satisfy his thirst and put up his horses, and where a lot of politics was discussed. The taverns were very important. They were there was nothing negative about a tavern. But we're not talking about this tavern tonight. This tavern burned in 1902. Was in business for 100 years, Archibald Perkins. No, we're talking about a different type of red light. We're talking about a red light district. For those who have zoning in mind, we're talking about a business in a residential zone. The Bethany Hotel. Many people confuse the Bethany Hotel with the Perkins Tavern, which was sometimes called Bethany Hotel. The Bethany Hotel in the 20th century looked something like this. This photograph shows a sign in front that says Litchfield Grill. There's a sign here for Philip Morris cigarettes. I think there's a beer sign somewhere. This was located on the southwest corner of Beacon Road and Litchfield Turnpike. As a matter of fact, if you look carefully today, you can still see some of these retaining walls. This particular establishment, unlike the Perkins Tavern, which was, remember, famous and known for miles around for the donuts that were produced, this establishment was infamous and was known for miles around, but not for donuts. Evidently, during Prohibition, it served as a speakeasy. Yes, right here in River City. On top of that, the interior of the building, and it's unusual that we have a photograph of the interior of the building. We have several actually that came from, this is from a 1936 newspaper. This particular establishment provided other diversions, and young ladies were available for entertaining travelers. Here. In 1936, a raid was conducted, and this seemingly innocuous-looking building, room, with an old-fashioned radio there. The radio was not the only entertainment, believe me. There was a trap door, and the police found a couple of sisters. I should love that secret trap door in the Wicked Inn. Okay. Are you beginning to get the red light connection? Okay, good. I don't like to be any too subtle. Evidently, this was the girls in the Bethany Hotel were kind of circulated around in New Haven, in New York and Connecticut. Here's another view of the structure. This actually is from the newspaper article. I'd never seen this side of it before. It was a pretty good-sized building. It was built in 1909 to replace an earlier inn that stood on the property. Again, not the Perkins Tavern, which was reputable. And I think there was an earlier store on the property. All of them had succumbed to fire, as did this one in 1938 or 39. The building caught fire, and our very new fire department, remember our fire department only started in 1934, our fire department was unable to put out the conflagration, or unwilling. And according to a witness, Arnold Peterson here, who was the only person that has admitted to ever being in this building, although he claims it was very innocent, he was delivering papers as a youngster. Okay, if you say so. It was an unsavory place. As a matter of fact, parents instructed their school children when walking to Gate School to cross over and walk on the other side of the road so that they wouldn't be as near the contaminating influence of this particular business. But it burned, and according to Arnold Peterson, the Board of Selectmen was standing in the road opposite the building and making comments to the effect that it was the best thing that ever happened to Bethany. And that brings us kind of to the end of this. Again, I hope this was brief enough. This is Madmere Mountain and the foliage in all its glory. I'd just like to close with this because I like this picture. This is kind of what it looked like from Carmel Road about a week or two ago, maybe, before the leaves had progressed as much as they have now. And I'm going to leave there, and we're going to go back to our list. And if we have some of the lights, maybe just the lights in the back. And timer, you don't know it, but you're being given a responsibility. And your responsibility is to determine by applause which one of these gets the most applause as the lie. Okay, are you ready?
I'm going to do it the other way.
So, if you think it's a lie, I want you to applaud when I point to it. Don't care what your neighbors say. Okay, number one, boundary by comment. Is it a lie? Okay. Number two, the bare facts. Is it untrue? Number three, a pirate's lair. Is it true, untrue? You can't clap twice. Cider barrel rules. Did I make it up?
Nope.
No. Trail of Tears. Is it a fabrication? Cut above the rest. Is it a lie?
No.
Death of a hired man. Did I make this one up?
No.
Horse of a different color. Is this one untrue? Flight of fancy. Untrue. Red light on Litchfield Turnpike. Is that made up? Good. You go for that. All right, Kyra. Which one did they say is untrue? I wasn't listening. Flight of fancy. Wrong. The one made up is a horse of a different color. There are pieces of truth in there, but no horse that belonged to Woodchuck Doolittle had anything to do with naming Madmere Mountain. I don't have a clue where it got its name. The parts that are true are Henry Doolittle was called Woodchuck Doolittle. He did sew his clothes on. Baron Allen was killed by a horse. But that's about it. I hope you enjoy this. No.
Hi, I'm doing the business, and I was asked to mention something that's incredible that happened to our friend Bob Brinton today. Not only is he a tireless civil servant for Bethany and a quintessential local historian, and perhaps a little bit of a humorist as well, but today he saved someone's life. He was driving on Hatfield Hill Road and noticed a car driving erratically, bringing off the road, and then it resumed speed while driving in the gutter, and Bob jumped from his vehicle and got into the car while it was still moving and shut the ignition, and then proceeded to call for help and helped administer oxygen to the gentleman, and even went as far as get the vehicle back to the person's house to help to assist this gentleman's wife. So I guess Bob perhaps saved someone's life today, and it's amazing how cool and collected he was after that heroism. I think a round of applause.